Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with a collection of recipes starring everybody's favorite tuber, the potato. That's right, from comforting casseroles to spectacular side dishes, these crowd pleasers are sure to hit the spot. So grab your russets, preheat your ovens, and as always, enjoy. Duchess Potatoes. That's right, I'm going to show you a very old classic potato technique, which until recently, I probably hadn't made in the last 10 or 15 years. So no, this is not trendy. But what it is a perfect special occasion side dish. Since not only is it easy, delicious, and very beautiful, it also comes out even better if you prep it ahead. And no, you do not have to own a piping bag to do these. So keep watching. And to get started, the first thing we'll do is peel some russet potatoes, and we're going to need about 3 pounds. And when you buy your potatoes, make sure they're about the same size, so they cook evenly once we cut them. And for that, what we'll do is cut them in half, and then we'll turn those onto the flat side, and then we'll cut the halves in half to make quarters. And by turning them up this way, I think it's a lot easier to get a perfect cut straight down the middle, since theoretically that highest point would be the center. Plus, with that nice flat base, they're very safe to cut this way. And then what we'll do is add our cut potatoes to a pot of cold fresh water, which should be enough to cover the potatoes by a couple inches. And then before we head to the stove, we want to very generously salt this water. All right, I think one of the secrets to almost all great potato dishes that require boiled potatoes first is making sure we cook them in well-seasoned water. And then once that's set, we'll place it on high heat, and we'll wait for that to come up to a boil. And then once it does, we'll back it down to medium-low, and we will simmer these potatoes until they're very, very tender, but not falling apart. Okay, if they go that far, they'll start to absorb too much water, and that's not going to be good. So we'll definitely want to test those with the tip of a thin knife. And sure, you could use a fork, but I find a fork can break the potatoes apart. And if they're not quite cooked, then you got broken pieces of potato cooking and probably overcooking. So I prefer a nice sharp thin knife. And once our potatoes are very tender, but not falling apart, we'll go ahead and drain those very, very well. And then we will let those sit in the strainer for at least 5 minutes, since we really do want these potatoes as dry as possible. And that's it. Once thoughtfully drained, we'll go ahead and transfer those into a bowl, at which point we'll take our potato masher and start working these over until they're almost, if not totally smooth. And if you've cooked your potatoes fully tender, this tool is really all you need to remove virtually all the lumps. But if you see a couple small ones, don't worry. We got lots of mixing and mashing still to do. And then what we'll do after this first initial mashing is stop and add our butter, as well as our salt, plus a little bit of pepper, which at culinary school would always be white pepper, since I guess potatoes are white. But you know me, I'm going to go with a couple shakes of cayenne. And then we'll also add a very small touch of freshly grated nutmeg. Right, not too much, just a hint. Okay, if any of your guests say they love the nutmeg in this, you put way too much. And then what we'll do is give this another mashing and a mixing until that butter completely disappears and the mixture is extremely smooth and hopefully lump-free. And what happens if you do have a few small lumps here and there? Nothing. Nothing at all. So try to relax. And then once that's set, we'll stop and lose the masher, and we will switch to a whisk for the last 2 ingredients, which are a splash of heavy cream and then 3 large egg yolks. And back in the day, when we would make these for a big banquet or party, the dessert served at the end of that event was almost always based on egg whites, or maybe a floating island or pavlova. So what I'm trying to say is do not throw away the egg whites. And that's it. All we need to do is whisk this thoroughly until everything's perfectly combined and the mixture's nice and light and fluffy. At which point we'll switch to a spatula and give this one final mix. And if we do see any larger than tiny lumps, we can go ahead and smash those with the back of the spatula. Not that those are any kind of real problem, but larger ones could get stuck in the tip at the end of our piping bag. So for that reason, having this lump-free is a pretty good idea. And that's it. We'll scrape down the sides and smooth out the top. And then what I usually like to do is cover this and let it cool down to room temp, at which point it's ready to shape, or we could just pop it in the fridge until we need it. All right, you can definitely make this mixture ahead of time and pipe it later. And if you have to shape these warm, go ahead. It's just that this does get a little firmer as it cools, which I find makes it easier to pipe and or shape. So I did let mine cool down before transferring some into a piping bag, at which point I'm going to go ahead and pipe that onto a parchment-lined baking sheet. And I'm going to go ahead and pipe 4 portions using a fairly classic design. And I'm just doing 4, but this recipe will make about 12 this size. Which reminds me, try to get them all about the same size so they cook evenly. Although the same size doesn't mean the same, and there's always going to be slight variations in each one. But that's fine, they're not supposed to all look identical. And if they did, that's what Mother Nature would refer to as unnatural. So just get them close, that's all we ever ask. And that's it, once piped, we can just keep those in the fridge until we're ready to bake. And then, in case you're wondering, how do I do these without a piping bag? Well, we could if we wanted to shape this with our hands, or as I'm doing here with an ice cream scoop. And then we'll use a smaller scoop to place a ball on the top of each one. So they look like, let's say, bells. And then what we'll do is take a fork, and we'll make marks all the way around, dragging from the bottom to the top, which will simulate those lines you get from a star tip on your piping bag. And I just keep it simple with straight lines. But if you want to do more of a swirl pattern, or maybe just make crosshatches, go ahead. I mean, you are, after all, the Duchess of York, of how to use the fork. But as long as you make some kind of markings, once these are baked, they're going to look awesome. And then to finish these, we'll go ahead and press the fork twice on the top like this, which I think makes for a very interesting design. And I mean actually interesting, not air quotes interesting. And that's it, those can go in the fridge as well. And then no matter which design you make or how you make it, once we pull these out of the fridge to bake, I think we want to drizzle a little bit of butter over the top. And I say drizzle, but you can also do a little bit of brushing, since once these are chilled they are pretty firm. But we still want to use a light touch, so as not to wreck those nice sharp edges. Oh, and if you're wondering, why didn't you line those up more uniformly? You know what, that is a great question, which I have no answer to. But I will apologize, since I know that's really bugging some of you. Oh yeah, you know who you are. But anyway, I will now distract you by sprinkling some cayenne over the top. Just a little shake on each to kind of warm up the appearance. And that's it, these are now ready to transfer into the center of a very hot 450-degree oven for about 20 minutes, or until those piped edges are beautifully browned and crisp, and the inside's heated all the way through, and they hopefully look like this. Oh yeah, those are pretty. And not just regular pretty, Duchess pretty. And if everything's gone according to plan, they should have held their shapes perfectly. And the bottom should be beautifully browned as well. And then, since I didn't have any fancy main course to take pictures next to, I simply transferred these onto a platter with a little bit of rosemary, some flowering rosemary to be specific. And that's it, these are now ready to present to your royal family. Mashed potato au gratin. That's right, I'm topping my favorite potato side dish with my other favorite potato side dish, to produce what I'm sure will be eventually known as the greatest potato side dish of all time. Maybe even the greatest recipe of all time. But I don't want to oversell this, so I'm going to stop the hype. And to get started, what we'll do is peel some russet potatoes, and then cut those in half right across the middle. And then if we stand those up on the flat side, it's pretty easy to cut those accurately in half again to make quarters. And once our potatoes are cut and covered by a couple inches of cold fresh water, we will place those on high heat, and we will add a very generous amount of salt to the water, which is always a key to making great mashed potatoes. And after giving those an unnecessary stir with our measuring cup and splashing out some water on the stove, we will wait for this to start to boil, at which point we can back our heat down to medium, and we will cook our potatoes until they're very tender, but not falling apart. And while we're waiting for that to happen, we can do a little prep on the potatoes we're going to slice for the top. And when I say a little prep, I mean very little, since all we'll do is peel them and slice them in half lengthwise, and then we'll simply leave those covered in water until we're ready to slice. And that's it. At this point, we'll go back and check our potatoes, which, like I said, should be very, very tender as tested with a knife, but they shouldn't be cooked so much that they start to fall apart. Otherwise, they'll absorb too much water, which obviously dilutes the flavor. But these were perfect. So I pulled them off the heat and drained them very well. And then once those have been thoroughly drained, we can put them back in the pot, and we can grab our potato masher and give these an initial mash. Okay, before we start adding stuff to mashed potatoes, it's always a good idea to mash them up fairly fine first. And once we feel like that's happened, we can stop and add our butter, as well as some salt. And if you swing that way, you can also add a few shakes of cayenne. And then we'll grab our masher again and continue mashing and mixing and occasionally stirring until that butter disappears and our potatoes are fairly smooth. And once that's been accomplished, we can stop and add the last 2 ingredients, which will be some whole milk, plus a nice big handful of whatever cheese or cheeses we're going to use. And I'm using something called Comté, which is very similar to Gruyere, and either would work, as would a nice aged cheddar, or of course a combination. And by the way, for extra richness, you could use cream instead of milk, but for me these are plenty rich enough, so I go with milk. And once we have that mash mixed and stirred in, our potato component is done. Possibly, since it's not really done until we taste it. And mostly we're checking for salt. And if it's tasting a little bit bland, go ahead and stir some more in. Otherwise, once that's set, we'll go ahead and butter a casserole dish, and we will transfer our potatoes in. And as usual, we'll make sure we're pressing everything into the corners, since the last thing we need here is giant air pockets. And even though these potatoes will sort of level out as they bake, the more uniform they are now, and the smoother we get the top, the better it's going to be for the next step. And then once our baking dish has been mashed potatoed, we're going to go ahead and season the top with some freshly ground black pepper, plus another generous application of salt. And you might be wondering, why not just put those in the mashed potatoes to begin with? Well, it's because in the next step, as you'll see, we're going to place sliced potatoes on top of this. And when we lay those down, I want those to be in direct contact with this extra seasoning. And how much of a difference is this really going to make? I have no idea, but it's more than none. And that's it. Once our surface is seasoned, we'll go ahead and grab our potatoes that we cut in half lengthwise, and we will carefully and very thoughtfully start making 1/8-inch slices. And by the way, I usually discard the first slice or two, since it's a little small. And please note, as I'm slicing, how I'm using my index finger on top to not only sort of hold things together, but after each slice, I'm sliding that finger over like 1/8 of an inch, and then place the side of the knife against it before the next cut, which is a great way to get nice even slices. And then the other thing to notice is I'm not chopping down with the knife. We start with a nice smooth forward cut, and then once we hit the cutting board, we finish the slice by pulling it back towards us, which is going to give you a lot more control and accuracy than if we're cutting straight down. And that's it. Once cut, we'll go ahead and make sure that's nicely lined up. And we'll slide the knife underneath and kind of fan that out. And we'll transfer it on top of our mashed potatoes. Oh, and the reason I placed this one in the center was because I thought I was going to do 3 rows. But after slicing and placing on 2 more, I realized I could fit 4. So I went ahead and repositioned those. So the moral of the story is never be afraid to change your mind in the kitchen. And that's it. Once I determined my final layout, I went ahead and continued cutting and placing. And fair warning, depending on the size and shape of the baking dish you use, as well as the size and shape of your potatoes, you may have to adjust your rows to make it all work. But bottom line, we pretty much want to cover the surface, with those potatoes being fanned out at a little bit of an angle, like you see here. And then once those have been placed on, we'll go ahead and generously salt the top. All right, even though the surface was seasoned, this is a good amount of potato we're putting on. And as you know, there's nothing worse than an under-seasoned potato. So we will definitely want to generously salt the top. And speaking of generously, once that's set, we'll take some melted butter and brush that all over the top. And don't be shy, we want these nicely drenched. And that's it. Once buttered, we'll finish this up with some more cheese, starting with our grated cheese, which again for me was Comté. And as usual, I don't like to put too much on the top. Okay, we don't want to completely cover the potatoes, so we'll basically just do a nice scattering. And then last but not least, we will finish up with a nice grating of Parmesan. The real stuff, of course, Parmigiano Reggiano, except no substitutes. And then before this goes in the oven, because I have everything piled up so high, I'm going to transfer this onto a sheet pan, since I'm very sure some of that butter is going to drip out, which I do not want burning on the bottom of the oven. And that's it. This is now ready to transfer into the center of a 450-degree oven for about 1 hour to 1 hour 15 minutes, or until those potatoes on top are tender. And it hopefully looks like this. And by this, I mean the most gorgeous potato gratin you or anyone has ever seen. Holiday Ham and Potato Casserole. That's right. I'm going to show you how to feed an amazing holiday meal to a large table full of hungry people using only 1 pound of ham, which is one way to go if the budget's a little tight. But if you've made a fortune with NFTs, which are, I have no idea. But anyway, if times are good and you were able to serve a whole ham, this recipe is absolutely perfect for the leftovers. And to get started, the first thing we'll do is a very simple, easy cream sauce. And that starts by sauteing some onions in butter over medium heat, along with a nice big pinch of salt. And what we'll do is cook those stirring for a few minutes, until they just start to turn translucent, or until they sort of kind of look like this. At which point we'll stir in some flour, which is what's going to thicken the sauce, and we will cook that stirring for about 2 minutes, just to take off that raw starchy edge. And if we want to sound like we know what we're doing, we would refer to this as a roux, R-O-U-X. But anyway, fancy French culinary terms aside, once that's cooked for a few minutes, we'll go ahead and dump in our cold heavy cream, and then we'll take a whisk and give that a good mix. And if you're thinking, I thought you had to whisk vigorously when you add that so you don't get lumps. Well, you don't. If your liquids are cold and your roux is hot, you will not get any lumps. Guaranteed. And if we do, we'll just say that was a piece of onion. Oh yeah, that's our cover story. But seriously, we actually have a t-shirt that says that. Hot roux, cold milk, no lumps. Speaking of which, once we've stirred in our cream, we will stop and add some cold milk, and we will whisk that in as well. At which point we'll raise our heat to medium-high, and we will cook this stirring occasionally until it just starts to simmer and thickens up beautifully. And in between stirrings, we can add a few more ingredients, including a little more salt, some freshly ground black pepper, and of course a few shakes of cayenne. And we'll give this a stir, mostly to make sure that sauce is not sticking to the bottom. And then I hate to spice shame anybody, but the next thing we'll do is grate in some fresh nutmeg, which is so far superior to the pre-ground stuff that I really hope that's what you use. And will I be ashamed if you don't? Yes, I will. But either way, we'll go ahead and stir that in. And before you know it, this mixture is going to start to simmer, at which point you'll see it thicken up significantly. And if everything's gone according to plan, it should look something like this. And once it does, that's it. We will turn off the heat, and we will whisk in the last two ingredients. A little dash of Worcestershire sauce, followed by, last but not least, some fresh thyme leaves. Or if you don't have a thyme plant on your windowsill, which you really should, a nice big pinch of dry thyme would be a good substitute. And once we stir that in, we'll grab a ladle, and we will simply reserve this until needed. So our cream sauce is looking good and ready to go, which means we can move on to the slicing of the potatoes, or potatoes if you can't find potatoes. And as usual, my preferred tool for this is this cheap mandolin slicer. And I don't like to slice these too thin. Alright, I'm shooting for about 1/8 of an inch. Right, maybe a little bit thicker. And of course, when you get down to the ends, be careful. And be sure to use this plastic guard, which I do every time that I do this on camera. And as we slice our potatoes, we're definitely going to want to keep them in cold water so they don't discolor. And no, we don't have to do them all at once. All right, we're going to do 3 layers, using about 3 potatoes per layer. So I'll often just slice 1 layer's worth at a time. And if you want to make these a little thicker or a little thinner, go ahead. I mean, you are, after all, the Jada Smith of your potato width. And anything close is going to work as long as they're consistent, which is why I like to use the vegetable slicer. All right, you can cut them by hand, of course, but it's so much faster and easier this way. And that's it. Once our potatoes are sliced, we can move into final assembly, which will start by covering the bottom of a large deep casserole dish with about 25% of our sauce, right, maybe slightly less, since I do like to save a little bit extra for the last quarter of the sauce, which goes on the top. But anyway, once that's in there, we'll go ahead and shingle our first layer of potatoes, which by the way have been thoroughly drained before placing them in here. All right, a few drops of water here or there are okay, but we don't want these dripping wet, since that will add too much moisture to the casserole. And after each layer of potatoes, we're going to want to salt the top of those generously, since like me, potatoes love salt. And that's it, we'll top those with about 1/3 of what's left of our sauce, which we're just dripping, we're not spreading. Okay, we don't want to wreck our nice, beautiful, even layer. And then we will top this with a generous application of grated cheese, which in my case was a nice white Irish cheddar, but something like a Gruyere, or really any other kind of melty cheese you like would work. And once that's down, we can place over our first layer of ham, and I'm using some beautiful pre-sliced French-style ham. And the thinner it's sliced, the better. So if you are doing this with leftover ham, you want to make sure you slice it really thin. And since we're doing 3 layers of potatoes and 2 layers of ham, and we're going to use 1 pound of ham, we want to place about a ½ pound per layer. Although I'm pretty sure I put more on this layer than the second one. But I don't think that really matters too much. And once that's set, we'll do another layer of potatoes, which we will definitely not forget to salt. And then we will spoon over a little less than half the sauce we have left. Since, like I said, we want to make sure we have plenty left to spread over the top. And then, of course, after the saucing, we will repeat the cheese and the ham in. And yes, as you may have noticed, I am giving each layer a little pressing, just to sort of compress things a little bit. And as I shingle over the last layer of potatoes, I will admit to saving the best, biggest ones for the last layer. Even though by the time this is baked and browned and bubbling, you're probably not going to notice any imperfections on the top layer anyway. But I did want to mention, in case you were thinking, man, this guy really lucked out. All the potatoes on that top layer look perfect. And then to finish this, we will ladle over all the rest of our sauce. And then we'll switch to a spatula, so we can make sure we scrape out every last bit. And then once we have that spread out as evenly as we can over the top, we will finish up with the last of our cheese. And that's it, our holiday ham and potato casserole is now ready to transfer into the center of a 350-degree oven for about an hour and a half, or until it's beautifully browned and bubbling, and hopefully looks like this. But we never rely on appearances, no matter how gorgeous they are, so we'll definitely want to test with a knife, which should slide in with no effort, since the only way to screw this up is to undercook the potatoes, which would be a crime against nature. And that's it. I like to let this sit for about 15 to 20 minutes before trying to cut it, just so things sort of set up a little bit. But don't worry, this thing stays hot a long time. Tartiflette. That's right, I've never heard of it either, which is why I was so excited to get a food wish for this. Because while I love doing recipes I know, what I love even more is learning about dishes I had no idea existed. So I did a little research, and after learning this is made with potatoes, bacon, onions, creme fraiche, and stinky French cheese, I decided to give this a try, and it came out awesome. So I decided to show you how to put this together, and it goes a little something like this. So first up, we're going to boil some potatoes in their jackets in salted water. And of course you could peel them first, but they come out much better this way. And please don't forget that salt. Very important, especially for something like this, we don't boil the potatoes in plain water. So what we'll do is we'll bring that up to a simmer on high heat, and then back the heat down to maintain a simmer, and we will cook those potatoes until they're just tender. We don't want them too firm, but we also don't want them crumbling apart when we go to slice them. So we will test those with a knife, and like I said, we want those just cooked. And at that point, we'll remove those to a plate to cool. And the great thing about doing potatoes this way is that once those potatoes are cool enough to handle, that skin is going to very easily peel off. So what we'll do is we'll just let those sit there cooling down while we move on to the second of the three major components of this dish, the bacon and onion mixture, which starts, not surprisingly, with a whole bunch of sliced up bacon. So we'll toss that in a dry, cold pan and set it over medium to medium-high heat. And we want to cook that bacon until cooked but not quite crisp. In fact, speaking of not crisp, the traditional way to do this is to start with the onions, cook those, and then add the bacon in. But to be honest, I don't understand that. I'm not sure why you'd start with the onions. Maybe one of our French fans will explain it to me. But anyway, like I said, we're going to cook that bacon on about medium to medium-high heat until it just starts to think about getting crisp and most of the fat's rendered out. And once that's happened, what I like to do before adding the onions is blot out some of that excess fat. All right, one problem you're never going to have with this casserole is not enough fat. So we'll soak up the excess with some paper towels, at which point we can add a whole bunch of sliced onions. And I notice some people do like to dice them, but I think the sliced work nicely and actually require less knife work. So we'll dump in our onions and then season that up with some kosher salt, as well as some freshly ground black pepper, and of course the obligatory shake of cayenne. And what we want to do is cook that on medium heat until the onions are soft, sweet, and kind of golden. And that is going to take a few minutes, so don't be in a big hurry. Okay, certain things can't be rushed, like me getting ready for a big date. So keep a cooking and a stirring over about medium heat or so until you end up with something that looks like this. And then what we'll do to finish this mixture off is dump in some dry white wine. No, not something expensive, but definitely something drinkable. And never, under any circumstances, buy or use anything labeled cooking wine. Just don't do it. It is the margarine of alcoholic beverages. So we want to use an actual real white wine. And we'll dump that in and we'll just cook it for like 2 minutes. Basically all we're doing is deglazing the bottom of the pan. So we'll just add that in and stir it around for a minute or two until the bottom of the pan is clean, at which point we can simply turn that off and reserve until needed. So our potatoes are cooked, our onions are set,
And we can move on to the third and maybe most important component, the cheese. And what we're going to want to use for this is something called reblochon. And I have good news and bad news. The good news is it is amazingly delicious. The bad news is you can't buy it in America because it's made with raw milk, which apparently we can't handle. But don't worry. There are some almost identical cheeses made in America you can use. And of course, I'm going to give you all that info in the blog post. And yes, it does look like a brie. And the reason for that is this variety of cheese is called a washed rind, which traditionally are some of your smelliest cheeses. Smelly in a good way, of course. And to prep this, what we'll do is cut it in half as shown. And then we'll split each half in half. And you know what? I really wish I had parchment paper under this. Because that cheese is so tasty, I would have licked that off the paper. See, now I have to lick it straight off the board, which is fine. And then once our cheese has been prepped, we can move on to final assembly. So by now our potatoes should be cool enough to handle, and we'll be able to scrape that skin off very easily. And once those have been de-skinned, we'll go ahead and slice those up into, in my case, some fairly thick slices. You could probably go a little thinner. And once those potatoes are cut, we're going to place about 60% of them in the bottom of a buttered casserole dish. And in case you're wondering, I believe this is a 2.5 quart dish. But anyway, we're going to lay in just over half our potatoes into the bottom. And yes, you can overlap them a little. Just try to get them as even as you can. And once that was set, I decided to give them a little sprinkling of salt. And I based that decision on tasting a piece of the potato and deciding I wanted a little more seasoning. And then once that first layer of potatoes is done, we'll dump over the entire contents of our bacon onion wine mixture, and we will spread that over as evenly as possible. And by the way, raise your hand if you were going to spread that unevenly, had I not said that. And I see no hands, so that's kind of obvious. And then what we'll do is arrange the rest of the potatoes over the top in hopefully some kind of overlapping, aesthetically pleasing way. And yes, I do see that little tiny piece of skin. Just ignore that. And then once that's set, we will French this up even more by spreading over some creme fraiche. And I believe technically this is an optional ingredient, but you know me and my creme fraiche fetish. So for me, definitely not optional. And once we have that spread over, we will place down our cheese. Definitely rind side up. And yes, I'm fully aware of how insane this looks. But this all works out, trust me. And by the way, if your cheese came with some paper attached, we're going to want to peel that off. Not even the French, who literally will eat anything, will eat paper. Although if you had to eat paper, this really is not a bad way to go. But anyway, I peeled that off. And then what we're definitely going to want to do before we bake this is transfer it to some kind of foil-lined pan. Because if there's one thing you don't want burning onto the bottom of your oven, it's really smelly French cheese. So we will place that on a pan, at which point we can transfer that into the center of a 375-degree oven for about 45 minutes or until it's nicely browned and your potatoes are perfectly tender. And when it's done, it should look something like this. That has to be one of the most interesting, most stunning, and most gorgeous things that's come out of my oven since I can remember. I just find the appearance beyond fascinating. And what's happened here is that creamy cheese is kind of melted and combined with that creme fraiche to form one of the most delicious cheese sauces I've ever had.
Crispy, no-fry Potato Pancake Poppers. That's right, these might only be half as tall as tater tots, but personally I think they're twice as good. And we are going to make what is my new favorite potato snack, with only a handful of ingredients, and no messy stovetop frying. Oh, and yes, if you're Canadian, you are allowed to call these crispy potato pucks, which reminds me these would be great for poutine. But first things first, and to get started, we'll begin by grating 2 potatoes into some cold fresh water. And I'm doing 2 potatoes because that's going to make 24 of these poppers. So if you want more, grate more, which would be no big thing, since grating potatoes is pretty easy. But you know what else is easy? Grating off a fingertip. So please, when you get down to the end, be very careful and take your time. And don't feel like you have to go all the way down to the last shred of potato. Even though I did, and I'll be a little disappointed if you don't as well. But also be careful. And that is what we call in the business a mixed message. And then what we'll do once our potatoes are grated is add the water from the bowl we kept our potatoes in into the main bowl. And we'll kind of swish that around because our next step here is rinsing off most of the starch. And for that, we're going to need even more water than this. So what we'll do is take this bowl to the sink and we will fill it up all the way almost to the top with cold fresh water. And we'll use our hands to swish it around, or if you want, slosh it around. And depending on the size of the bowl, we'll do this once or twice or maybe 3 times, or until the water we're pouring off looks pretty clear, which mine does. So that means most of the starch has been rinsed off. And once that's happened, we'll go ahead and transfer this into a strainer and let it drain. And not just drained, well drained. at which point we'll pull it out of the sink and transfer our grated potatoes onto a nice clean kitchen towel. Because before we add this to our mixing bowl, we're going to want to squeeze out as much excess water as we can. And I'm sorry, but I have to compliment myself, since I usually try to do this with a few layers of paper towels. But what happens is about halfway through the squeezing, the thing explodes, and I have to give up and end up using a kitchen towel anyway. So this time I decided to save a step. And that's it. Once we've squeezed out as much water as we can go ahead and transfer that into a mixing bowl and add the rest of our ingredients, which will include some garlic powder, which for these at least works better than fresh for some reason. We will also, of course, want some salt, as well as some freshly ground black pepper. And then we'll shock the world by adding a few shakes of cayenne, plus a little drizzle of olive oil, followed by our last two ingredients, which is some all-purpose flour and some freshly and finely grated Parmesan cheese. And while the order of the other ingredients doesn't matter, these last two do, since by adding our Parmigiano Reggiano on top of the flour, as we start to mix this with our fingertips, that starch is going to kind of coat the little particles of cheese, and we are not going to have to worry about any clumping, which can happen if finely grated Parmesan hits wet ingredients. But anyway, we'll go ahead and mix this very thoroughly with our fingertips, using a fairly gentle, thoughtful, and dare I say, loving touch. And we'll continue mixing until we think everything's thoroughly combined, and the mixture begins to feel a little bit damp, at which point we'll stop, because it's done. And our mixture is now ready to transfer into our prepared mini muffin tins. And by prepared, I mean very, very generously brushed with butter. Right, not just a little butter. Right, we want to be dripping in at least about a half a teaspoon for each one. And also, we want to make sure we're brushing along the sides as well. And yes, as you may have noticed, we have these placed over a sheet pan, which makes them easier to get in and out of the oven, but also helps diffuse and even out the heat. And that's it. Once we have those pans buttered profoundly, we'll go ahead and start transferring in our potato mixture. And as we do this, we want to make sure we're grabbing the mixture from the bottom of the bowl. And that's because the salt we added is going to draw out moisture. And if we start filling these by grabbing mixture from the top, the last ones we do will be a lot wetter than the first ones. So I need you to get right down in there and get in there deep. And if everything goes according to plan, 2 large russets should make enough to fill up 24 of these cups to about a ½ inch above the top of the pan. And then once we have our mixture transferred in, what we'll do is go around and clean these up. And by the way, this same technique will work in regular sized muffin pans. And I'm only using these so I can call them Potato Pancake Poppers. But if you want them bigger, make them bigger. I mean, you are, after all, the Patty Smith of your patty width. But if you are going to use a regular sized muffin tin, I would only fill them maybe halfway up. Otherwise, the inside might not cook all the way through by the time the exterior is done. And that's it. Once our pans have been successfully filled, they are ready to transfer into the center of a nice hot 450-degree oven for about 40 to 45 minutes, or until they look like this, which is a gorgeous golden brown on top and a beautifully brown caramelized crusty bottom. Okay, so the tops look good, but we'll have to flip one of these over to check the bottom, but not yet. Okay, we want to let these sit and cool for 5 minutes before we do, so they have time to contract a little bit, which will also make them unstick from the bottom. So we'll let those sit for a little bit before we turn one over and check it out. And oh yeah, that looks like we nailed it. And since that one's perfect, we can go ahead and flip these over, and we will assume every other one is just as beautiful, except a few of them weren't. So at this point I was faced with a big decision. I could just keep moving and pretend it didn't matter and serve them as is. Or, because we never want to let the food win, I could take the ones that were a little lighter and pop them back into the tin and back into the oven and simply give them another 5 or 10 minutes until they were as beautifully browned and as magnificently crustified as the other ones. Which is what I did, and I'm glad, since these really should be cooked until the bottoms and outside edges are crispy. And then there are 2 main ways you can serve these. And the first way is to serve them up with that flat brown side down and that rougher, gnarlier golden brown side up, which is perfect for when we're going to use these as a base for a topping. For example, the classic combination of sour cream and chive. And by the way, when you serve them like this, some people call them bird's nests, and you can just place your fixings on top like I'm doing, or you can make a little depression in the top with the tip of your finger, and then spoon things in like caviar, or loaded baked potato fixins, or even something like a gorgeous Indian chutney.